Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, you grab your phone, you open Google Maps, and everything is different. The continents look wrong. Borders are shifted. Russia is no longer there. Instead, in big letters, it says Tartaria, a name stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. You search online, nothing. You ask your history teacher, they have no idea what you're talking about. But the map doesn't lie. It's there. And you're the only one that can see it. Welcome to this episode. Today we are going to talk about Tartaria, an empire that filled half the world's maps for 200 years and that almost no one had heard of today. We are going to find out whenever it was the greatest civilization in the world ever forgot or whenever it was just a name on a map. Sit back. This is really, Let's begin. I want to start by telling you about a map. It's from 1624 and it was drawn by Abraham Orpheus. He was the first person to create a true modern atlas, a book of maps that more or less fit together. On that map, somewhere in Asia, it says Tartaria. It's not a small region, it's enormous. From the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, from Siberia to the Himalayas. And it was just not Orpheus. I see dozens of maps from the 16th and 17th centuries, French, Dutch, German, English. They all call it something similar, Magna Tartaria, Grand Tartary, Great Tartaria. In the 1771 edition, the first edition of the Encyclopædia Britannica, it was published. It says, Tartaria is a vast country in the northern part of Asia, bordering Siberia to the north and west, and which is called Great Tartary. Great Tartary, the largest country in the world, according to Britannica in 1771. So, what happened? Because in 1850, Tartaria is gone. Gone from maps, gone from the Encyclopedias, gone from memory. Ask an historian today what Tartaria was, most will shrug. Some will say it was an old name for Siberia, others will call it a misunderstanding. But here is what keeps me awake at night. If it was just a mistake, why has it been on every map for 200 years? If it was just another name for Russia, why did it suddenly disappear? And if it never existed, why are so many different people talking about it? In the last 10 years, Tartaria has become one of the most debated conspiracy theories on the internet. On YouTube, videos on the subject has hundreds of millions of views. On Reddit, thousands of users discussed the mud flood, the flood of mud that supposedly buried Tartaria cities in the 19th century. On TikTok, people zoom in on old photographs on building with windows underground and ask, why is the first floor buried? And in the center of it all is a question that no one really can answer. What happened to Tartaria? Today we are going to dig into that question. We are going to look on maps, the buildings, the photographs, the documents. We will hear what the proponents say and what the skeptics answers. And in the end, we will try to figure out what is fact, what is interpretation, and what might be visual thinking. But before we begin, a small disclaimer. I'm René. I speak Danish, and as a Dane, I have a special talent for pronouncing foreign names, especially those with lots of consonants, few vowels, or just a general resistance to Danish tongue placement, just a slightly wrong. So when I say Tartaria, Tunguska, or something else, please bear with me. I promise that the content is better than the pronunciation. Let's start. What does the historian say? If you ask an ordinary historian today what Tartary was, you will get roughly this answer. Tartaria was never a country. It was a geographical concept. Just as when we say Scandinavia today about a region with several countries, European cartographers in the 16th and 17th centuries used the word Tartary for the vast areas of Central Asia and Siberia that they do not know very well. The name comes from Tatar, a term for various Turkic and Mongol people who lived on the steppes. And why were they called Tatars? Well, that takes us back to the 13th century. The Mongol invasion of Europe under Genghis Khan and his successors was so brutal that the Europeans began associating the invaders with Tatars, the Greek word for the underworld, a place so deep that even the gods fear it. So Tatars, well, it's hard not to see the connection. So the name was originally a mix of real people, the Tatars, and the methodical reference to hell. But here is what is important. Tartary was not a central governed state. It was never an empire with a capital, an emperor, a flag, or an army. It was a cartographical catch-all. When European cartographers didn't know who lived somewhere or which kingdom controlled the area, they simply just wrote Tartary. It was convenient, it was imprecise, and it struck for centuries. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Russia began expanding into Siberia. Cities like Tobolsk, Tomsk, and Irkutsk were founded. Borders were drawn, and as the Russian gained control over these areas, Tartary disappeared from the map, replaced by the Russian Empire. By the 19th century, Tartary was largely gone, not because anyone hid it, but because it was no longer useful. That is the official explanation. And it's actually quite reasonable, but there is a problem. There are maps, many maps where Tartary is just an empty region. There are maps with cities, with borders, with rivers, with mountain ranges, descriptions of governments, of empire, of flags. And that starts to look like something other than unknown territory. Let me give you an example. In 1650, the Dutch cartographer Jan Blok published a large world atlas, one of the maps where it says Tartary or the Empire of the Great Khan. It says that in plain text, not region, not unknown, but empire. And he's not the only one. In 1626, the map of the English cartographer John Speed, it says a new map of Tartary, and the map shows borders, cities, and even an image of the Great Khan. So the question is, if Tartary was just a loose concept, why did the greatest cartographers of the time treat it like a real kingdom? And that brings us to the first crack in the official narrative. Let's travel back to the 1730s. St. Petersburg, the Russian Empire, is becoming a European power. The city is new. Peter the Great built it on a swamp. And in the middle of the city, in the Kunstkammer, stands a giant globe. It's called the Goddard Globe. It's over 3 meters in diameter, and it's covered with copper plates engraved with a world map. The globe was completed in the 1650s in Germany. Peter the Great received it as a gift and brought it to Russia. And on that globe, something interesting is written. On the Asian part of the globe, east of the Ural Mountains, it says Tartaria Magna, or Great Tartaria. It was not an empty region, but a named territory with borders. And here's what is important. The globe was renovated in the 1750s after a fire. The original copper plates melted, and they were replaced with new ones. But Tartary was not removed. It's still there. So, if Russia had an interest in erasing Tartaria from history, why didn't they remove it from their own globe? And it's not the only globe. In Moscow, in the State Historical Museum, there's another globe. It was made in the 1650s by Jan Blok. Again, it says Tartaria. Again, it hasn't been removed. It's as if Tartary was a part of the normal worldview until it suddenly wasn't. Let's jump forward to 1771. Encyclopædia Britannica. In the first edition, Tartary is described as a large country with provinces, Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. But already in the second edition, just a few years later, the word begins to disappear. By the 17th century editions, Tartary is reduced to a footnote, and by the 20th century editions, it's gone. The question is why? The official explanation says better geographical knowledge. The Russian mapped Siberia Tartary become obsolete. But that doesn't explain why the word also disappears from the Russian maps. Or are there documents well into the 19th century where the Russians official writes about Tartary as a country once traveled to? Let me take a quote. In 1734, Empress Anna Lodinova issued a decree. It was about trade routes. It says, permission to travel to Great Tartary, to Burka, to Samarkand. It's an official Russian decree, not a foreign cartographer, not a conspiracy theorist, but the Russian Empress's own government. If Tartary didn't exist, what were they traveling to? Now we come to the heart of the mystery, the alternative theory, with thousands of people online spending hours researching, says something completely different from the official story. It says Tartary was real. It was a global civilization, perhaps the most advanced of its time. It stretched from Eastern Europe to America. It has colossal cities, impressive architecture, and technology that we only rediscovered in the 20th century. And then, somewhere, sometime in the 18th, 19th century, it was destroyed, not by a war, not by disease, but by a deliberate act, by a global elite that wanted to hide the truth about our past. It sounds wild, I know. But let me present the theory as the proponents do. The first evidence is the buried buildings. If you walk through old districts like St. Petersburg, New York, Paris, Berlin, you will notice something strange. Many of the older buildings has windows that starts below ground level. Not basement windows, but regular windows with decorations that continues into the ground. In some places, the entire first floor is buried. You enter through a door that was once on the first floor. Now it's in the basement. So what happened? The official explanation says city raised their street level over time due to floods, sewer systems, or planning. The alternative explanation say a global mud flood. A single catastrophic event buried the cities in one moment. And the evidence, yeah, look at the photographs from the 19th centuries. There are images from cities like Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco showing excavations where dirt is being removed from the streets, revealing windows and doors that were previously buried. In some pictures, workers are standing down on one uh, at what that once was street level with building's original entrance about their head. The theory says the disaster happened, the cities were buried, survivors dug into the upper floors and built a new street on top of the rubble. And then we forgot what happened. Take a flight, at least in our mind, to San Francisco. Look at the Palace of Fine Arts. Large domes, columns, classical proportions. Now, go to Moscow. Look at St. Basil's Cathedral. Domes, arch, same style. Now go to Beijing. Look at the Forbidden City. Domes, arch, same idea. Now go to Budapest, to Paris, to Rome, to Istanbul. Everywhere you see buildings with an architectural similarity as if they were drawn by the same hand. The official explanation says it's neoclassicism, a style that spread across the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. The alternative explanation says it's Tartarian architecture, remnants of a global civilization that later powers took over and called it their own. And here's one of the most cited arguments. Many of these buildings are said to have been built in the 19th century, often in record time, without modern machinery, without construction cranes, without photographic documentation of the building process. And yet, they stand there perfect, monumental. How? Next evidence: the lost cities. On old maps of Tartary, there are cities marked, dozens of cities, that does not exist on any modern map. Cities like Rustina, Seaponath, Krashli. Historian says that there were never really cities. Cartographers invented them. Proponent says they were real cities. They were buried or destroyed and then removed from history. And then there is Magnasaya, a city in Siberia. On old maps, it is marked as a wealthy trading city. In official history, it flourished in the early 17th century and then disappeared. Why? The official explanation: the city burned. Trade routes changed. The alternative explanation says that the city was a part of Tartary. When Tartary fell, Magnasaya fell with it. Next evidence: technology. This is where it gets really speculative, but also fascinating. Proponents point out to old photographs of buildings with metal spirals on the roof, copper balls on domes, and antennas long before the radios was invented. They point to Nikola Tesla, one of history's greatest inventors, who worked on wireless energy. His Wardenclyffe Tower from the 1901 looks like something that could have been stood in the Tartary. The theory says that Tartary had free energy. They draw electricity directly from the atmosphere. That is why there's no chimneys. That is why they had domes and spirals. When Tartary fell, the technology was concealed because it was dangerous to those who made money from coal and oil. Is it true? We don't know, but it's a part of the story. Next evidence: the maps. Proponents shows maps after map from the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th centuries, all with Tartary written in large letters over half of Asia. They ask, if Tartary was a myth, why did it keep appearing for 200 years? Cartographers weren't stupid. They didn't just copy each other's mistakes. They used travelers' accounts, merchants' reports, and diplomats' dispatches. When everyone say the same thing, that there was a large kingdom in the east, there were probably something to it. Next evidence: the erasure. And now we come to one of the most controversial points. The theory says that Tartary didn't disappear on its own, it was actually erased. In the 19th century, at the time Tartary vanished from the maps, something else happens. Libraries burn, documents disappear, archives were closed. History is rewritten by those who won. Who were they? Well, there's different answers. Some points to the Roman of Destiny in Russia. They held power over the areas that were once Tartary. They wrote history so that they themselves appears as civilizers and not as conquerors. Others point to the Catholic Church or the Jesuit order, which supposedly had an interest in hiding a non-Christian civilization. Still others point to an international elite of bankers and politicians, the same ones who, according to the theory, still rules the world today. It's a great narrative. It has elements of archaeology, cartography, architecture, technology, and conspiracy. The question is, does it hold up? To answer that, we have to go deeper. We have to look at the evidence one piece at a time and see who's strong, what is weak, and what might be a good story. So let's do that. Now begins the real work. We are going down the rabbit hole, the connections, the patterns, and related mysteries that makes the Tartary's history so compelling. Because Tartary is not just about Tartary, it's about something bigger. The question of why we believe what we believe. Let's start with one of the most concrete physical evidence, the buried buildings. If you walk through Seattle's underground, a tourist attraction where the old streets are preserved beneath the new city, you can see storefronts with windows and doors that are now underground. Official explanation: after a major fire in 1889, the city decided to raise the street levels to prevent flooding. The new city was built on top of the old. The alternative explanation: the fire was an excuse. The original buildings were buried by mud. People dug into them and raised the streets to hide the evidence. The problem: there is documentation of the fire. There are city plans showing how the streets were raised. There are photographs of the reconstructions. So Seattle's underground is hardly evidence of a global catastrophe. But there are other places. In St. Petersburg, a city built on a swamp, streets has also been raised several times, because otherwise the city would drown. In Paris, during Baron Haussmann's renovation in the 19th century, entire neighborhoods were demolished and rebuilt. Old street disappears, new ones appear. In Rome, in the Roman Forum, the oldest building lies several meters below the current street level because the city was built on top of itself for 2,000 years. The point is, city grows layer upon layer. That's not a conspiracy, it's archaeological 101. But proponents of Tartaria claims that layers are too uniform, that the burial happens too quickly, that there's no intermediate debris, only clean soil. Is that true? Here we run into a problem. There is no scientific studies of soil layers that confirms a mud flood in the 18th or in the 19th century. Geologists can date soil layers. If a global catastrophe had occurred, there would be traces in ice cores, in tree rings, in sediment layers. Those traces does not exist. That doesn't mean that there couldn't have been local floods. There have in 1815, the year without summer, after the Tambora volcanic eruption, there was crop failure across the globe. But that was ash in the atmosphere, not mud over cities. So the mud flood was a global event, should we say, that lacked geological evidence. That is a weakness. Then we have the architecture. It's true there are similarities between buildings in different parts of the world, but there is also explanations. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the neoclassicism was the dominant style in Europe and its colonies. Buildings were meant to look like ancient Greece and Rome: columns, domes, symmetry. When the United States was founded, the capital, Washington, D.C., was built in the neoclassical style because Americans saw themselves as heirs to the Roman democracy, or republic to be precise. When Russia wanted to modernize under Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, they brought Italian architects to build palaces and cathedrals in the same styles. When Britain built in India, in cities like Mumbai and Calcutta, they built in the neoclassical style because that is how they built. So the similarities can be explained by cultural diffusion, not by a global civilization. But proponents respond: if they built in the same style, why did they build the same style in Australia, in New Zealand, and in South Africa? Well, because British architects traveled up to the colonies. Why did they build in China? Because the European powers and later Chinese rulers with European inspiration built in the style that was modern. It's boring, it's prosaic, but it's also the most plausible explanation than a hidden civilization. Then there's the maps. The maps is perhaps the strongest argument, because there is no doubt that Tartary appears on hundreds of old maps. But the question is, what does it mean? Historians like Matthew Etney, a professor of cartography, explains the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries were not like like our maps today. They were a mixture of knowledge, rumors, guesswork, and political messaging. When a cartographer wrote Tartary, it could mean Tatars lived here, or here in this area we don't know, or here is the old Mongol Empire. It was not a precise definition of a state, or should I say, a delineation of a state. And here's an important point. Tartary borders change dramatically from map to map. Something, sometimes it goes to the Volga, other times it goes to the Pacific, sometimes it includes China, other times not. If Tartary was a real empire, the borders should have been more fixed, and they are not. So the maps does not support the theory of a central governed kingdom, but they also does not support the official narrative that Tartary was just an unknown territory. Because there's too many details, too many cities, too many descriptions. The truth is probably somewhere between. Tartary was a concept, but a concept with historical content. Like the Orient or the Levant, words that covers real places but without precise borders. Where does the territory theory actually come from? Well, it's not an old tradition, it's a modern phenomenon. The earliest sources I can find are from the 1990s Russia. There, alternative historians like Nikolai Levashuk and Anatoly Fomenko spoke of a hidden Russian past. Levashuk is a self proclaimed academic who wrote books about Slavic Aryan empires. He claims that Russia had actually ruled the entire world until the West conspired to hide it. Fomenko is a mathematician. His new chronology claims that all of the ancient history is invented, and most of events actually happened in the Middle Ages. Both were widely rejected by historians, but the ideas spread online and they became mixed with maps, photographs, and architectural observations. In the 2010s, interest exploded. YouTube channels like Mind Unwild and Tartaria Explained compiled the evidence into hour-long videos. The Reddit forum, Cultural Layer, which originally dealt with archaeology layers in cities, became a center for the Tartaria discussion. And suddenly there was a movement. And what does Russia say about this? And here there's something that surprises many. Official history in Russia today also does not recognize Tartary as an empire. Russian historians explain Tartary in the same way as Western one does, as a geographical concept. But there is a nuance. In recent years, there has been official events using the words Tartary in a positive context. In 2018, Vladimir Putin presented the president of Tatarstan, the Republic of Tatarstan in Russia, with a copy of an old map showing Tartary. This was interpreted as a symbolic gesture, an acknowledgement of the region's history, and not a confirmation of an empire. But conspiracy theorists saw it as a proof. that even Putin knows that Tartary was real. In 2022, the Russian Academy of Science held a seminar titled From the Tatar Empire to the Russian Empire under Peter the Great. The wording is interesting. Tatar Empire, not Tartary. And the seminar was about state formation, not conspiracy. But proponents cite it as with yet more evidence. So, what is going on? Is Russia reintroducing Tartary into the historical textbooks? I don't think so. I think it was an attempt to include Tatarstan and Siberia's history in the Russian narrative without challenging the official chronology. But it creates confusion, and confusion is fertile ground for theories. Then there's the connections. The Tartaria theory is rarely alone. It's often connected to another alternative histories. The mud flood, which we already have discussed, the white pyramids of China, which some believe are evidence of a global civilization, lost technology, which Tesla allegedly rediscovered, secret societies, which supposedly hides the truth, the new chronology, which claims that our entire calendar is wrong. The deeper you dig, the more connected it becomes. And that is what both theories' strengths and weakness. Strengths, it feels like you're rediscovering a network of hidden knowledge. Weakness, when one piece falls like the mud flood, the whole house of cards risk collapsing. So, who started this? Let's try to find the early sources of the Tartary theory as we know it today. I took through forums, books, and videos. It appears that the theory in modern form was born on the internet around 2015 to 2016. Before that, there was shattered references, liver shock, flamenco, and a few YouTube videos. But it wasn't until people started sharing maps and photographs on Reddit and Facebook that it became a movement. One of the first major videos was Tartaria, the Lost Empire, uploaded in 2016. It has over 1 million views. Today, there are hundreds of channels. Some of them have well over 100,000 subscribers, some over a million. And here's what is important. None of these channels present new evidence. They reuse the same maps, the same photographs, the same arguments. This suggests that the theory isn't growing because new evidence is emerging. It's growing because the story it tells is compelling. And that brings us to the central questions. Why do we believe it? We heard the theory, now let's hear the critic. And the critic is harsh. Let me introduce you to one of the strongest opponents I have found, Aidan Mattis. He's an historian specializing in Celtic history and medieval studies. He runs a YouTube channel called The Law Lodge. In 2023, he made a series totaling over 3 hours on Tartaria. He goes through every single piece of evidence and dismisses it. Let me summarize his main points. First, the maps. Mattis points out that the maps proponents' sites are often misunderstood. On many maps, Tartaria appears, but also do Siberia, Russia, and China as separate regions. The maps do not show a unified empire, it shows a mosaic of people and areas. Furthermore, proponents often quote a single sentence from an encyclopedia but ignore the rest. In the 1771 Encyclopædia Britannica, it's true that Tartary is described as a vast country, but it also says it's a part of Asia, not an independent state, and that it is inhabited by Tatars, Mongols, and other nomadic peoples. That is not a description of an empire. His next point is the architecture. Mattis point out that the buildings proponents called Tartarian were actually built in different centuries. by different architects for different purposes. Yes, there are similarities, but the similarities are because architects copied each other's styles, not because that they all built for the same empire. Moreover, there are blueprints, letters, and documentations for many of these buildings that were constructed. Take the 1893 the Chicago World Fair. Proponents say that the exhibition buildings were Tartarian ruins that were reused, but Mattis find contemporary newspaper articles describing the construction process, foundation works, scaffolding, workers. There are photographs of the constructions, there are accounts, ledgers for materials, everything that indicating that the buildings were built and not reused. His next point is the mud flood. Here, Mattis is relentless. He points out that there is no geological proof of a global mud flood in the 18th or 19th centuries. There is also no contemporary accounts of such a catastrophe. If a mud tsunami had buried cities around the world, someone would have written about it. They didn't. What about the buried windows? Mattis explains that it is often due to urban renewal. Cities raised streets to improve sewer systems or to protect against river flooding and not rain from the sky. In Seattle, for example, streets were raised after a fire, not by a mud flood. And there is documentation on the decision. There is meeting minutes, there are city plans, and there's newspaper articles. Nothing suggests a conspiracy. Then his next point is the technology. Magits point out that there's no physical proof of Tartarian energy generators, no machines, no devices, no technical drawings. The spiral and ball proponents point out are ornamented, are try again, ornamentation, not technology. Moreover, most of the buildings with these spirals were built in the 19th century, long after Tartaria disappeared from maps. So even if the spirals had a function, which they don't appear to do, it would have been too reason to be Tartarian. Then there is the sources, and here he comes with the most devastating critics. Mattis point out that many of the sources proponents are unreliable. For instance, they often cite a book by Conor McDarry from the 1920s. McDarry claims Irish to be the world's oldest language and that all civilization originated in Ireland. McDarry was not an historian, he was an amateur. His theories has been rejected for nearly 100 years. Yet the Tartaria proponents cite claim him as an authority. Similarly, they cite Nikolai Levashenko. Those books has been declared extremist in Russia, and Anatoly Fomenko, whose new chronology has been rejected by virtually all historians. Mattis' point is, if you only cite discredited sources, something is wrong. And then there's the burden of proof. And the final critics is methodological. Proponents of the theory claim that there has been a global conspiracy to hide the truth. The problem is that such a conspiracy would require thousands of people to participate: cartographers, historians, architects, archivists, librarians, politicians, and so on. And there's no proof of such a conspiracy ever took place. There's no secret documents, no leaked emails, no witnesses. All proponents has the absence of evidence that some document has been lost, and for some questions that remain unanswered. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of a conspiracy. It's just absence of evidence. Mattis' conclusion is clear. Tartary was not an empire. It was a geographical concept used during a period when Europeans had limited knowledge of Asia. When knowledge improved, the concept disappeared. The mud flood, it's called urban renewal. The architecture, yeah, that's neoclassicism. The maps, that's misunderstanding. The technology, fantasy. The theory originated on the internet in 1910s, built on discredited sources and selective reading of historical document. It is not supported by scientific research, and it has no evidence that cannot be explained otherwise. So, is the case closed? Not quite, because critics like Matix also have their blind spots, and let me explain. We heard the theory, we heard the critics, and now let's try to separate the things. What are documented facts? What are likely and what is possible? And what are speculation? Let's take it step by step. We start with the documented facts. The following thing we can say with high certainty. It's a fact that Tartary was a name on old maps. There are hundreds of maps. The name disappeared in the 19th century. That's also a fact. There are buildings with buried windows in many old cities. That is a fact. There are architectural similarities between buildings on different continents. That is fact. There is no geological proof of global mudflood in the 18th or the 19th century. That's a fact. There are no contemporary account of such a catastrophe. That's a fact. The alternative Tartaria theory emerged on the internet in the 1910s. That's a fact. This is the core. Everything else is interpretation. So if you look at the likely conclusions, um, and we look at the evidence, the following are likely. Tartary was not an empire in the modern sense. There is no evidence of a central governance, fixed borders, or permanent institutions. The mudflood was a series of local events and not a global catastrophe. Cities raise streets for practical reasons floods, sewer systems, fires, etc. The architectural similarities are due to cultural diffusion, not a global civilization. Neoclassicism was an international style in the 18th and 19th centuries. And most of the Tartary theory sources are unreliable or discredited. McDary, Levashov, Fomenko, none of them are recognized historians. Now we come to the possibilities, and here it becomes more open. Could there have been a political entity in Central Asia that Europeans called Tartary? Yes. The Mongol Empire was such an entity, but it disappeared in the 14th century, long before most Tartary maps were even drawn. Could documents have been lost intentionally or unintentionally? Yes. Archive burns, document disappears. It happens all the time, but that is not evidence that it was coordinated to hide Tartary. Could a natural disaster had occurred in the 18th century that affected large area? Yes, you know that. The Laki volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783 affected all of Europe. And then there was the Tambora in 1815 that affected the whole globe. But none of them buried cities in mud. And now we go into downright speculation. And here is where the theory leaves the evidence behind that Tartary was a global civilization with advanced technology. We have no evidence of that. That Tartary was deliberately destroyed by an elite. Again, no evidence. That there are hidden archives with the true history. No evidence. That the technology was based on free energy from the atmosphere. No evidence. This is speculation. Not necessarily wrong, but it's not supported by the data. But if you look at the unanswered questions, and that is what still bothers me, after reading Mattis' critics, after reviewing the evidence, there are questions that official history does not really answer. The first question: why is Tartary detailed on some maps? If it was just a concept, why do cart- cartographers mark specific cities? Why draw borders? Why describe the government? This is not Terra incognita, that is Tatar Empire. The next question is, why does Tartary disappear so suddenly? Yes, I agree, knowledge improve, but that does not remove a name that has been used for 200 years overnight without something happened. So, what happened? Question 3. Who were the Tatars? Official history says that they were Mongols and Turkic nomads, but some sources describe them as tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed. Hmm. Not like, not like Mongols. Are they just bad descriptions, or is something else going on? So, next one. Why are there so many Russian documents mentioning Tartary as a country? We saw the 1734 decree. There's no misunderstanding. This is an official document. If Tartary does not exist, why did the Russian empress write about it? Why didn't she know? Question 5. Why are there so many architectural similarities that are hard to explain by simple cultural diffusion? I'm thinking of building with identical proportions across continents, built in the same decades, with no visible communication between the architects. Is it just coincidence, or is this a common source? And here is my honest assessment. The official history explains a lot. It explains the maps, it explains the names, it explains the buried windows, it explains the architecture. But there are remnants, small, nagging remnants, that does not quite capture. And those remnants are what the Tartary theory feeds on. Not because the theory is true, but because it asks about something that official history has never really answered. What if Tartary was a political entity, not just in a European sense? What if it was a confederation of tribes or city states with a shared culture but without a central government? What if it disappeared wasn't an empire but a way of life? What if the story of Tartary is the story of how we forget? That brings me to something neither proponents or skeptics has talked about enough. Maybe Tartary isn't about a lost empire. Maybe it's about our longing for mysteries. We live in a time when the world has been fully mapped. There's no blank spots on the globe anymore. There's no unknown continents, no hidden civilization waiting to be discovered. Satellites see everything. Drones fly everywhere. Google Earth has photographed every square meters. And that's wonderful, but also a little sad, because human needs mysteries. We need something just beyond our grasp. Tartary is such a mystery. It's a story about an empire that was filled half the world maps and that almost no one knows today. It's a story about colossal building that looks like that they were buried in mud and about windows that started underground. It's a story about conspiracy, about hidden archives, about an elite that deliberately erased our past. And that is compelling. But compelling is not the same as true. After digging through hundreds of sources, after reading both proponents and skeptics, after looking at the maps, the buildings, the photographs, I land here. Tartary existed, but not as an empire. It existed as a concept, a way for Europeans to understand the vast eastern areas they didn't know. The mudplot existed, but not just as a global catastrophe. It existed as a local urban renewal, street racing, civil systems, and rebuildings after fires. The architecture existed, but there's no evidence of a global civilization. It's evidence that sorry, it's evidence that architects in the 18th and 19th century copied each other's styles, and that European powers exported their building practices into the colonies. The conspiracy, it only exists as the narrative. There is no evidence that anyone deliberately erased Tartary from history. It's only the normal that knowledge changes, that archive burns, that documents are lost, and that history is always written by the victors. But there is one thing I learned from this research. When people believe in Tartary, when they spend hours investigating maps and photographs, when they share videos on YouTube and discuss on Reddit, it's not about a lost empire. It's about trust. Trust that official history has hidden something. Trust that there is another truth. A truth that is bigger, more fantastic, more meaningful than the boring version that we learn in school. And that trust is not entirely unfunded. History is not objective. It is written by people with opinions, interests, and power. There are things we do not know, things that has been forgotten, things that has been actively suppressed. That's not conspiracy, that's history. So what is Tartary? Tartary is a mirror. It reflects our own longing to find something greater than ourselves, something that can explain why the world is the way it is. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to find it. Maybe the search itself is valuable. I started the episode with a question: what happened to Tartaria? Now, after hours of research, I think the answer is both simpler and more complex than I expected. Tartary disappeared because the world changed. Russia expanded, maps improved, the concept became obsolete. But Tartary also disappeared because we humans need to forget. We forget what doesn't fit into our worldview. We forget that our knowledge is always incomplete. We forget that history is always written by someone with a purpose. And then one day we discover an old map and ask, what is this? And the mystery begins again. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, we will dive into another forgotten chapter of the history. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and don't forget to ask questions, even if the answers are uncomfortable.